Giving a gift that you make typically means more to the person receiving it than if you were to just give something that you purchased. So in this video, I'm going to make a few gift boxes to give out as gifts for Christmas. I'm using curly maple and what I think is spalted soft maple. I know it's spalted, I'm just not sure if it's soft maple or not. But anyway, these are a couple boards that I purchased from Bob Close in a recent trip to Wisconsin. And if you're interested in some really figured wood, then stop by his website. He stocks figured stuff, has really good prices, and he does ship, so you don't have to be local to Wisconsin. While I was there, though, I spent a few hours with him in his shop with a couple friends of mine, and Bob is just a really, really cool, genuine guy. So if you're interested, be sure to check out his website. I'll post a link in the description below. Something I picked up from Bob was that the most figure on the wood will be on the bark side of the wood. In this case, it worked out really well because the board that I had some defects in it that prevented it from being used on its full width, and the side that was convenient for me to use was also the side that had the most figure in it. So I used the jigsaw and bandsaw to cut out what I needed. Next up is the jointer and planer to get the boards flat and parallel. And this was my first experience using really figured wood on a jointer and planer, and the helical head on my jointer left a nearly flawless surface with no tear out, whereas the straight knife cutter head on my planer really didn't do that good of a job. I had to go extremely shallow with my cuts and use the slow speed to prevent tear out, which just meant that the process was really, really time consuming compared to the better cuts with a helical head. The stock I started with was a heavy 4/4, so I resawed everything right down the middle and then planed it to 3/8 of an inch thick, which is what I wanted for the box sides. Now from here, I used a couple spacer blocks at my miter saw to cut the 4 box sides in a way that there will be a start and stop point in the grain. One of the back corners is where the grain will start, wrap all the way around the box, and then stop, because that's just how I've made boxes previously. However, I posted something on Instagram and a bunch of people showed me that there is a way to make a continuous grain box where the grain goes around all 4 sides and there is no start and stop point. I'll post a link at the end of this video to a video showing that method. At this point, the sides looked a little bit tall, so I trimmed them down on the table saw, and I don't recall what this dimension was. I wasn't necessarily going for a certain number, but just whatever looked appropriate. And then I tilted the blade to 45 degrees and made a test cut on some scrap plywood to make sure everything would line up once it was assembled. And it's important to do that because you don't want to go through the process of milling all your lumber and getting all the pieces nice and neat, only to find that the joints you cut weren't set up properly with the tooling so that it doesn't close together when it's assembled. So take the extra step and make a test joint and you'll have a lot less frustrations in the long run. But the setup I used here was just 2 miter gauges connected with a sacrificial fence, and these are just screwed together, and a stop block positioned so that I'm not necessarily removing length but just beveling the edges. And this worked out really well. I wanted to make the top and bottom panel the same material and also glued into a rabbet, but in order for this to work, I need to make veneer and glue that onto a piece of plywood and make a plywood panel. That way the panel is dimensionally stable and I shouldn't have to worry about any expansion and contraction, and I can just glue it into place. Now the plywood that I'm using is sold locally as 5mm hardwood plywood underlayment. I'm not sure if that's locally everywhere. But anyway, I also made sure that the plywood was cut with the top and bottom layers perpendicular to the wood that I'm gluing on. So basically I'm using plywood to make thicker plywood. After those panels dried, I used one to set the height of my table saw blade and cut a rabbet the same depth as those panels were thick on the top and bottom of all of my box pieces. And that way, once the box is glued together and the panels are sitting in place, they will be flush with the top of the sides. Now, the rabbet width was sized so that there's only about 1/16 of an inch of material that will be on the outside of the boxes, covering up the end grain of the plywood panel. As the old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's really true in this situation. So to prevent any glue squeeze out from staining the interior of the box, I taped off all of the inside faces. And this was actually really time consuming. I underestimated how much little tedious processes that this project had. But anyway, the tape can be used also as a clamp to roll up the boxes with glue in the joint. And I find that a cheap paintbrush is perfect for applying glue in these situations. And you can get like, I don't know, 24 of these little tiny brushes for a couple dollars at a dollar store. Next up, the plywood panels can be sized to fit into the top and bottom rabbets. And because of the way I will inlay some walnut on the top and bottom perimeter a little bit later, absolute precision isn't necessary. And when sizing the top and bottom panels, I'd actually prefer it to be a little bit on the loose side, as glue will hold everything in place, and if it's too tight, it just involves another risk of me breaking the thin sides of the rabbets as I'm gluing the top and bottom into place. Once the glue dried on those, I set the table saw blade so that it was 3/16 of an inch high, and the outside face of the blade was 3/16 of an inch away from the fence. This allows me to take 2 passes to create a symmetrical rabbet on the entire top and bottom perimeter, and regardless of how precise the top and bottom panel were sized in the previous step, this new cut is beyond the perimeter of those panels and into the area, which creates a new precise line where the panel ends. I wanted a high contrasting wood to inlay in the rabbets, so I chose walnut, and I had to go through the milling process on this board because it was rough sawn to begin with. But then I cut a few strips that were exactly 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch square. And anytime you are making specific sized inlays for a project, it's a good idea to cut a few extra pieces so that you can keep working in the event that you accidentally make a wrong cut during installation. And I say that from experience. Because my shooting board is set up for right-handed use, I worked clockwise around the box when fitting the walnut. And my process may be a little bit different than yours, but for me, I first make a rough cut at 45 degrees with a handsaw, and then make an accurate 45-degree angle with the shooting board. Then put it in place and use a scrap piece with another accurate 45-degree angle to see if the piece is the appropriate length, to see if the miters line up, and then trim it down as needed until that piece is perfect on both ends. And then once a piece is fitted, use a couple pieces of blue painter's tape to hold it in place while you work on the next piece. With all of the walnut pieces cut, you can use the tape to lift each piece out of the rabbet, insert glue, and then tape it back down. With the walnut glued in place, I alternated between a couple hand planes to trim it flush with the box, and to prevent tear out, I planed into the corners in a couple situations, and when I was getting down to the last tiny little bit, I used my block plane in such a way that at the end of the cut, I skewed the plane similarly to a paring cut with a chisel so that I was slicing away the last corner and reduced the chance of tear out. I used the table saw to separate the lid, which is always a little nerve-wracking when you get this far into a project and you have to cut it up. But I read somewhere that it's a good idea to set the blade so that it doesn't cut all the way through the wall thickness and just leaves a little bit left, which will eliminate the possibility of damage as the second piece might accidentally contact the blade as it is removed. Then you can break the pieces apart with a sharp utility knife, and this actually worked really, really well. A little bit of sanding to remove the saw marks, and then the hinges can be installed. Now, to lay out the hinges, I first marked the same distance from each side with a marking knife, and then the hinge itself can be traced with a marking knife, and a wide chisel can follow that up to make the knife lines just a little bit more pronounced to the eye, so you can see them just a little better. With the geometry established, I set a router to a depth of half of the closed hinge and carefully removed all of the interior material, making sure to not touch the layout lines and to not rock the router any. Then a sharp chisel can clean up the mortise quite easily. I used a marking awl to mark the screw holes slightly offset to the inside of the box. And that way, when the screws are driven down, the head of the screw will force the hinge to seat tightly into the inside face of the mortise. And when using screws this small in hardwoods, it's a really good idea to add a tiny bit of wax to the threads. You really don't want to break off a screw into the material this far into the project. After a little bit of sanding, I applied a couple coats of shellac for a finish. Now, I'm not entirely done with this project at this point, but as it sits, the boxes themselves are done. I only added hinges to 2 of the 4 because I want to do something different with the other 2, and I didn't add anything to the insides just yet. I'll cover all of that in the next video. So until then, have a good one, and I'll talk to you later.